The last transmission came at 0244 hours. A man's voice, broken, rasping, barely human, cutting through static. "Leave me. Get them out. That's an order." Then silence. Not the quiet kind. The kind that fills a room and doesn't leave. Captain Ethan Cole, the most decorated Special Operations Commander in Blackstone Division's history, vanished inside a burning mountain pass with 40 armed fighters between him and everything that mattered. Command wrote the report, marked the box, closed the file. But one operator refused to accept that ending, and she was the one nobody believed in. If you've never seen a story like this, subscribe to the channel right now, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to know exactly how far this story has traveled. Don't move. This is the one you'll be talking about. The Corvon Ridge didn't care who you were. It didn't care about your service record, your commendations, the patches on your shoulder, or the number of deployments stamped into your personnel file. The mountains were indifferent in the way that only things without memory can be, ancient, brutal, and entirely unmoved by human ambition. At 4,000 meters, the air thinned to something that punished every breath. Ice formed on weapon barrels. Batteries died faster. Human judgment, already compressed by fear and exhaustion, compressed further until what remained was something close to instinct and not much else. The ridge ran northeast to southwest along the border of the Corvon Autonomous Region, a stretch of frozen terrain that no government officially claimed and every military faction unofficially wanted. It had been a contested problem for 3 years. It had been their problem for 6 months. Supply lines moved through those passes. Intelligence assets operated in those valleys. And on the night of March 14th, a mountain that had swallowed smaller operations whole turned its attention to one of the best teams Blackstone Division had ever fielded. It became a trap. Special Operations Captain Ethan Cole had led 11 operators into the mouth of that trap at 2100 hours, moving in 2 4-man fire teams with a separate overwatch element positioned 600 meters to the northeast on a ridgeline the mission planners had labeled Observation Post Vega. The objective was straightforward on paper: extract 2 civilian intelligence assets from a mountain safe house before a rival militia unit reached them first. Time on target was estimated at 40 minutes. Total mission duration, door to door, just under 3 hours. Cole had run harder missions on less sleep with fewer people and worse terrain. He wasn't nervous. He probably should have been. The safe house sat in a shallow valley depression between 2 rock faces, accessible by a single dirt track that switchbacked down from the northern approach. Cole's primary element came in from the west, moving single file through a pine tree corridor that smelled of frozen sap and old snow. No moon. Minimal ambient light. They were running thermal optics and navigating on muscle memory, the way operators do after enough years of doing this exact thing in enough different countries that the specific geography stops mattering and only the geometry remains. Sergeant First Class Darren Okafor was on point, 5 meters ahead of Cole, picking the path through the rocks with the quiet confidence of a man who had been doing this since before some of his teammates had finished high school. Behind Cole was Corporal Jay Lim, the team's comms specialist, carrying a radio rig that weighed almost as much as his body armor, and that he treated with more care than most people treat living things. Behind Lim came the rest of the element, 8 men in varying states of alertness, breath visible in the cold air despite every effort at noise discipline, weapons up, eyes moving in the patterns they'd drilled until the patterns became reflex. "Vega, this is Cole. Give me a current picture," Cole said into his headset, his voice barely above a murmur. He had a way of communicating under pressure that sounded almost conversational, not because he was relaxed, but because he'd learned early that the tone of a commander's voice travels faster than any order, and calm was something you could transmit. The response came back clean and immediate. "Cole? Vega. Safe house appears cold. No movement on the approach track. 2 heat signatures inside the structure, stationary. 1 vehicle on the eastern side. Engine warm, no occupants visible." "Copy. Anyone in the valley?" A pause. 3 seconds. 4. Long enough to notice. "Negative, valley reads clear." Cole exhaled slowly. He didn't like the pause. It was a half-second longer than it should have been from an operator who had nothing to report. He filed it, said nothing, kept moving. The safe house was a two-room stone structure that looked like it had been built during a different century and abandoned during this one. The walls were thick fieldstone, the roof was corrugated metal with rust bleeding down the corners, and the door was steel, welded rather than hinged, with a latch that required two hands and a specific angle to operate. Cole's team stacked on it with the practiced economy of people who had performed this exact movement more times than they could remember. Bodies flat against the wall, weapons oriented, spacing correct, every man knowing exactly where he was relative to the man beside him without having to look. Okafor took the door. Cole flowed in behind him, the rest of the element fanning into corners. The two intelligence assets were exactly where they were supposed to be. A man and a woman, both middle-aged, both clearly exhausted in the particular way that comes from sustained fear rather than physical exertion. They were wearing more layers than people who were supposedly ready to move at short notice, and the man started speaking the moment Cole crossed the threshold. Low, rapid, a language Cole understood functionally, but not fluently enough to track in real time under pressure. "Easy," Cole said. He held up a hand, palm out, the universal language. "We've got you. Lim, tell them we have 15 minutes on this location, and then we're walking regardless of what they're carrying, light gear only." Lim moved forward and translated. The woman grabbed a canvas bag and clutched it to her chest. The man's speech accelerated. "What's he saying?" Cole asked, eyes already moving to the window. Lim's expression shifted. Something crossed his face, not alarm exactly, but the precursor to it, the moment before the word arrives. "He says the route is compromised. He says they were followed here. He's been trying to reach us by radio for 2 hours." Cole looked at the man directly. "How many?" "How many did he see?" Lim asked. Listened. "He doesn't know a number. He saw vehicle lights on the northern approach, approximately 40 minutes ago." The northern approach. The exact route their exfil vehicles were staged on. Cole was already at the window. "Okafor, western side now. Tell me what you're looking at." Okafor moved to the opposite wall, pressed himself to the edge of the window frame, and spent 5 seconds scanning the ridgeline. 5 seconds felt like a long time. "Movement, upper western ridgeline, above the pine corridor we just came through. I'm counting at least 6 separate heat sources. Moving downhill, deliberately. Vega, this is Cole. I need eyes on the northern approach. Priority." The pause this time was longer, 7 seconds, 8, and when the Overwatch operator's voice came back, it had changed, still controlled, but thinner, the compression of someone managing information they didn't want to be managing. "Cole, 3 vehicles on the northern pass, no lights, moving toward the valley floor. And I have personnel dismounting on the eastern ridgeline, multiple contacts. I'm still counting. Cole, this is a coordinated encirclement, all 4 approach corridors." The room went still in the way that rooms go still when everyone in them arrives at the same conclusion at the same moment. Cole looked at Lim. Lim looked back at him. "Vega, where's the softest point right now?" "Western corridor, but it's closing. You've got maybe 4 minutes before they're fully in position." "We go west. Everyone move. Package stays between elements. Okafor on point." He didn't waste words beyond that. Neither did anyone else. What happened in the next 14 minutes would later be reconstructed from radio logs, medical reports, and the accounts of the men who survived it. It would never be fully reconstructed because the parts that mattered most happened in the dark, in the noise, in the space between decisions where there isn't time to think and training takes over or it doesn't. They came out of the safe house at a run. The intelligence assets struggled immediately. The woman was in reasonable shape, but the man was moving wrong, favoring his left side, something nobody had flagged in the pre-mission briefing because nobody had bothered to ask. Cole clocked it in the first 20 meters and repositioned Corporal Webb to the man's left, close enough to grab him if he went down. The pine corridor was darker than it had been going in. The temperature had dropped another 2 degrees in the 40 minutes they'd been on target, and the snow that had been holding off all night was finally making its decision. Fat flakes, isolated at first, falling at an angle that suggested wind was building from the northwest. They were 60 meters into the corridor when the first explosion went off. Not a grenade. Something larger, pre-positioned, command detonated, probably buried along the approach route during the window when Vega was reporting the valley clear. The concussion wave came up through the ground before it came through the air, A sensation like the earth making a decision, and it knocked two operators off their feet and sent a shower of frozen dirt and pine fragments across the entire element. Cole was already moving before the sound finished. Push through. Keep moving. Contact came from above. Muzzle flashes from the ridgeline. Not random, disciplined, overlapping fields of fire that suggested someone had spent time planning angles. Cole's team returned fire in controlled bursts, suppressing without stopping, eating ammunition at a rate the mission load hadn't been designed to sustain. Okafor went down at the 40-meter mark. Not dead. Cole could see him still moving, one hand braced against a tree root, the other pressed to his thigh where the round had gone in. But down, unable to run, and in the calculus of a moving firefight, down was a category that had to be solved immediately or it became permanent. Webb, Okafor, now! Webb broke from the line without being told twice, got under Okafor's arm, took his weight. They were slower for it. Everyone was slower. Then Webb himself caught a round, not clean, grazing across the left shoulder at an angle that spun him half around and cost him his rifle. He stayed on his feet. He kept hold of Okafor. But he was done as a shooter. Lim was next. A grenade burst 30 meters uphill, and the shrapnel pattern caught him across the right side. Not penetrating, but the radio rig took the worst of it and went down with a sound like breaking electronics, which is exactly what it was. He ripped the harness off without slowing, kept moving with just the handheld unit clipped to his vest. Cole was running the arithmetic in real time, and the arithmetic was unambiguous. 3 men compromised, 1 radio rig lost, ammunition at 50% across the element, 2 civilians who could not fight, enemy forces on 3 confirmed sides with a 4th unknown. The exfil vehicles were inaccessible. Staging on the northern approach meant they were either captured or the drivers had withdrawn per protocol, which was the right call and the wrong outcome simultaneously. Air support was 20 minutes out minimum, and that estimate assumed the weather held, which it was not going to do. He pulled out the secondary handheld radio, encrypted, short range, the backup for situations exactly like this one, and made the call. Command, this is Cole. We are in heavy contact. 3 casualties, 2 walking wounded, package intact. Exfil route is compromised. I need QRF and close air support. Grid follows. He read off the coordinates. Acknowledge. The reply came back broken, the mountains doing what they always did with signals, eating them, reflecting them into fragments. He caught pieces. Weather window closing fast, QRF at minimum 40 minutes, hold your position, and hold your position. Cole looked at the corridor around him. Enemy closing from the west. Enemy already positioned above. 2 men who couldn't run. 2 civilians who'd never run fast enough. 40 minutes was an eternity. He made a decision that existed in no field manual he had ever read. Okafor, talk to me. I'm not going to make the pace, sir. Okafor's voice was level, not scared, resigned in a way that was almost professional. You know that. I know what I know. Lim, take the package. Webb, you're on Okafor. Move to the drainage gully at 250 and get low. Air assets will reach you there. Move. What are you doing? Lim asked. What it looks like. Cole checked his magazine, seated it. Move, Lim. That's not a discussion. Lim held his gaze for 1 second. Then he turned and moved. 600 meters to the northeast, on a slab of exposed rock with the wind cutting across her at 30+ kilometers per hour, Sergeant Maya Voss had been watching all of it through the Schmidt and Bender scope of her 338 Lapua precision rifle. She had already put down 4 contacts on the western ridgeline, 4 shots, 4 hits, no wasted rounds. But the geometry was working against her. A rock outcrop jutted from the cliff face at exactly the angle that blocked her sightline into the lower section of the pine corridor where the main contact was heaviest. She had been trying to raise Cole on the primary net for 4 minutes. Static. She could see enough. She could see the element moving. She could see the 3 compromised operators and the civilians and the enemy elements converging. She could see the mathematics of it as clearly as she could see anything through a precision optic on a clear night. She could also see something Cole couldn't. A flanking element, 12 fighters, maybe 14, working around the southern base of the western ridge at a rate that would put them in position to cut off the drainage gully within 3 minutes. The element Lim was leading toward safety was running directly into a closing door. Maya keyed the radio. Cole, this is Voss. Come in. Nothing. Any element from Vega, respond. Webb's voice came back, strained and irregular, breathing hard. Voss, what have you got? Southern approach is compromised. Flanking element, 14 contacts, moving to cut off the gully at 250. You need to vector further west. There's a secondary drainage at 235 that runs deeper. It'll add 400 meters, but it keeps the ridgeline between you and them. Do you copy? Copy. What about the captain? Maya moved her scope back to the pine corridor. Cole was alone now. The element had moved. He was positioned behind a rock outcrop at the corridor's midpoint, drawing fire from two directions simultaneously, burning through ammunition with the deliberate economy of someone who knows exactly how many rounds they have left and is making each one matter. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to be loud enough and present enough that the enemy's attention stayed on him rather than on the people moving away from him. She understood it completely. She had understood it the moment she saw the element start moving without him. The hollow feeling that opened in her chest was not something she named. She pressed it flat and kept working. Voss? Webb's voice again. The captain. I see him. Get moving, Webb. Vector 235. Go right now. She heard them go. The sound of movement, boots on frozen ground, someone breathing through pain, the woman making a sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite not. She kept her scope on Cole. She made the shots she could make. 3 more contacts on the ridgeline above him. 2 clean, 1 marginal, the target going down but not staying down, which meant he was hurt and not dead and would be a problem again in under a minute. She noted it, moved to the next target, came back to the marginal hit on the follow-through. This time, it stayed down. Cole held his position for 3 more minutes after the element withdrew. Maya was there for all of it. She gave him everything she could give from 600 meters. Bought him seconds with trigger pulls, fractional delays in the enemy's advance, moments of chaos when a target that was standing suddenly wasn't. It wasn't enough to change the strategic situation. It was never going to be. But it kept him alive 3 minutes longer than he might have been, and those 3 minutes were the ones his team needed to reach the drainage gully. She was still watching when the explosion happened. 3 hours. A bright orange flash at the base of the rock outcrop where Cole had been positioned. Not massive, not a vehicle-borne device or an artillery round. Contained. The kind of blast that came from a grenade or a small IED in a tight space. The kind that didn't necessarily kill the person at the center of it, depending on distance and body armor and the specific cruelty of physics on any given night. The radio carrying Cole's voice cut to static mid-syllable. Maya sat motionless on the rock. Her breathing was controlled. Her hands were steady. She ran through what she had seen, what she knew, what she didn't know. The explosion had been at the outcrop, not inside it. Cole had been mobile, and mobile meant he might have moved in the seconds before detonation. Might. The smoke was thick and the angle was bad, and she couldn't see a body because she couldn't see into the center of the blast zone from her position. She didn't let herself reach a conclusion. Conclusions, in the absence of evidence, were just the stories you told yourself. She keyed the radio. Command. Sergeant Maya Voss, OP Vega. Captain Cole's position has been hit. No comms, status unknown. Element is withdrawing via alternate route. Requesting guidance. The response came back fragmentary. She caught enough. Voss, extract to RV Alpha immediately. All elements withdraw. Acknowledge. She looked through the scope one final time. Smoke. Falling snow. The orange after image of the explosion fading from her thermal. No movement from the outcrop. No signal. Every protocol pointed the same direction. Every trained response, every procedural obligation, every rational calculation about what one person alone could do against a mountain full of armed fighters in degrading weather. All of it pointed toward RV Alpha, toward extraction, toward the command structure doing what command structures were built to do. She sat on the rock for 30 more seconds. The wind was picking up hard from the northwest now. The snow was no longer isolated flakes. It was a wall. She looked northeast instead. The ridgeline extended for miles. Broken terrain, no trails, hard going in daylight, and nearly impossible in the dark. Enemy elements were somewhere in those mountains. Cole had been alive 3 minutes ago. The explosion had been contained. Body armor was rated for... You're rationalizing. She was. She knew that. She acknowledged it the way you acknowledge weather, as a fact of the environment that doesn't change what you're going to do. Maya Voss stood up. She checked her ammunition. 40 rounds remaining. She checked her emergency pack. 48 hours of supplies if she rationed hard. She checked the secondary radio. Operational. She oriented northeast. She started moving. Behind her, the snow came down heavier, and within the hour it would cover her tracks completely, erase every trace of the direction she'd chosen, make the mountain look as though nobody had been there at all. Well, back at the extraction point, Webb's count came up short twice. He checked it the way you check things when the number keeps being wrong. Methodically, hoping repetition changes the result. It didn't. "Where's Voss?" Lim said. Nobody answered. Webb tried the radio. Open air. Nothing coming back. In the vehicle, the intelligence asset sat wrapped in emergency blankets and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and the men around them were not in a place where conversation was possible. Okafor had his eyes closed and his jaw set. Webb was staring at his hands. 3 hours later, a duty officer at Blackstone Forward Base filed 2 incident reports in sequence. The first listed Captain Ethan Cole as missing in action, presumed killed, pending weather clearance for recovery efforts. The second listed Sergeant Maya Voss as absent without authorized leave following a direct evacuation order. Colonel Reese Alderman reviewed both files at 0600, made his notes, moved on to the next item. In the margin of Voss's file, he wrote 4 words in the clipped shorthand of a man who had never spent a night on a mountain in his life. Emotional, poor judgment, disciplinary. Outside the base perimeter, the Corvon Ridge had disappeared entirely behind the storm. The mountains were invisible. They looked from the right angle like they had never existed. The radio on Webb's vest crackled once, just static, just noise, just the mountains playing tricks the way they always did. But Webb sat up straight, and he listened for a long time after it stopped. The static on Webb's radio lasted 3 more seconds, and then went completely dead, and that silence was somehow worse than the noise had been. He clipped the radio back to his vest. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't make it worse, and the men around him understood that instinctively, the way soldiers understand things that can't be put into briefings or after-action reports or any of the formal containers that the military uses to process experience into documentation. They rode back to Blackstone Forward Base in a vehicle that smelled of blood and wet gear and the particular cold that gets into everything at altitude and stays there long after the source of it is gone. And nobody spoke for the entire 40-minute drive except once, when Okafor asked Lim for water, and Lim handed him the bottle without a word, and Okafor drank from it and handed it back, and that was the whole of the conversation. The base received them the way bases always receive incomplete elements, with medical personnel who moved efficiently and with purpose, with a duty officer who needed information formatted in a specific way within a specific time frame, with the machinery of documentation that ground forward, regardless of what anyone felt about it. Okafor went straight to the surgical bay. Webb's shoulder was cleaned and packed and declared non-critical by a medic who had the practiced brevity of someone who had made that declaration many times before on things that looked worse and on things that turned out to be worse than they looked, and who had learned that the distinction mattered less than getting to the next patient. Lim sat in the debriefing room for 2 hours and answered every question put to him with the careful precision of a man who was holding himself together through the act of being accurate, because accuracy was something he could control, and control was the only thing keeping the rest of it at bay. Nobody asked Webb about Voss until the following morning. When they did, it was Colonel Reese Alderman himself who asked, and he asked it in the tone of a man who had already formed his conclusion and was collecting testimony to support it rather than to test it. Alderman was 53 years old, thick through the shoulders in a way that suggested he had once been fit and had since become merely large, with close-cropped gray hair and the flat, declarative eyes of someone who had spent enough years in administrative command that certainty had become a default posture rather than a considered position. Sergeant Voss was given a direct evacuation order, Alderman said. He was seated behind his desk with a ceramic mug and a manila folder and the specific posture of a man who considers his office a command environment and everyone who enters it a subordinate by definition. "You're telling me she acknowledged that order?" Webb was standing. He hadn't been offered a chair. He'd noticed that. "I'm telling you she was actively coordinating our extraction on the radio when I last had contact with her, sir." "That's not what I asked." "She saved our lives. Whatever procedural question comes after that, What comes after that, Alderman said, cutting across him without raising his voice, is that she ignored a direct order, abandoned her assigned position, and is currently unaccounted for in hostile terrain. That is what comes after that. He set the mug down. I understand she had a relationship with Captain Cole's unit. I understand that creates attachment, but attachment is not a tactical asset, Sergeant, and it is not an excuse. Webb looked at the wall behind Alderman's head. He found a point on it, a small imperfection in the paint, a circular discoloration about the size of a coin, and he focused on that point and kept his voice completely neutral in the way that requires more effort than shouting. With respect, sir, Sergeant Voss neutralized 4 contacts on the western ridgeline before we made entry on the safe house. She identified a flanking element on the southern approach that command's pre-mission intelligence had not flagged. She vectored us to an alternate extraction route under active fire. Without that specific intervention, the element and the package do not make it to the exfil point. You can't know that. I can know it pretty well, sir, because the route she redirected us to was the only corridor that wasn't already blocked when we used it. 10 minutes later, it was blocked too. She gave us a window and we made it through that window. That's not speculation. Alderman looked at him for a long moment. The look of a man who doesn't appreciate being corrected and has the institutional gravity to ensure it doesn't become a habit. She's listed as AWOL pending investigation, Alderman said. That's the current status, and that's where it will remain until she's recovered, or until the situation changes. Dismissed. Webb walked out of the office and down the corridor and out through the side door into the cold morning air, and he stood there for a while just breathing, watching the mountains to the northeast. Visible now, the storm having moved east overnight, the Corvan Ridge laid out in sharp relief against a pale winter sky that offered light without warmth. He was still standing there when Lim found him 20 minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee that had gone lukewarm on the walk from the mess. What did he say? Lim asked, handing over one of the cups. What I expected. Lim looked at the mountains. AWOL. Yeah. They stood there in silence for a moment, both of them looking at the same ridge, the same dark, jagged line above the closer foothills. She's not AWOL, Lim said. I know that. She made a tactical decision based on available information, and she executed it. I know that too. Alderman doesn't care about the distinction. No, Webb said. He doesn't. He drank some of the lukewarm coffee. Pull whatever terrain imagery you can get on the northeastern sector, past OP Vega. I want to know what's out there. Lim looked at him. You think she went northeast? I think she went wherever the evidence pointed her, and the evidence from the corridor was all northeast. He paused. Cole went northeast too. If he survived the blast, and I'm not ruling that out, he would have moved away from the sweep teams, which means away from the western approach. Northeast is the logical vector. Lim nodded slowly. He was already running the analysis in his head, Webb could tell. That was how Lim worked, the calculations happening behind his eyes before his expression caught up. I'll see what Hendricks has in the system. It might take a while. The northeastern sector isn't current priority mapping. It should be. Yeah, Lim finished his coffee. It should be. He went inside. Webb stayed at the perimeter and looked at the mountains until the cold became genuinely uncomfortable. And then he stayed a little longer because discomfort seemed like the appropriate condition for the current situation, and leaving felt wrong in a way he couldn't fully articulate. 3 days passed at Blackstone Forward Base. The operational picture updated itself around the edges without changing in its center. Patrols went out and came back. Intelligence reports circulated and were filed. The weather cycled through 2 more fronts that rolled in from the northwest and broke apart over the ridge, leaving alternating windows of visibility and whiteout conditions that made any recovery operation into a planning exercise rather than an executable plan. The status board reflected all of this in the neutral language of colored symbols and grid references, which was a language specifically designed to remove the human content from human events. Webb and Lim appeared in the intelligence section at irregular hours. Captain Hendricks, who ran intel with the careful efficiency of a man who understood that his job was to make other people's decisions better, rather than to make decisions himself, let them work. They were generating product. They were doing it systematically, without drama, and the product was substantive enough that Hendricks found himself looking at it more than once and thinking about it between other tasks. On the second day, Lim assembled an analysis that Hendricks took to Alderman's office personally. There's a facility, Lim said, spreading the imagery across the table in the intel section before Hendricks carried it upstairs. He had been awake for the better part of 36 hours, and it showed in the way he moved, with the particular careful deliberateness of someone managing a body that had exceeded its preferred operating parameters and was being held to task by sheer discipline. Here, northeastern sector, roughly 40 kilometers past the OP Vega ridgeline. Former border installation, decommissioned 8 years ago. It's outside the current threat mapping boundary, which is why it doesn't appear in the pre-mission overlays. Hendricks studied the satellite imagery. What makes you think it's active? Vehicle movement patterns. Lim laid a trajectory overlay beside the base imagery. 3 separate vehicle signatures over the past 72 hours, all converging on this grid. Not transiting, converging. That's destination behavior, not route behavior. Supply convoys transit. Personnel moving to a specific location converge. Could be a supply cache. Could be, but look at this. He placed a third document on top. A signals intercept summary, partial decode, the kind of fragmentary intelligence product that got filed in the lower tier of the morning brief, unless someone was actively looking for a reason to read it. Traffic volume spiked the night of the 14th, right around our contact window. It sustained at approximately double baseline for the next 18 hours and then normalized. Something changed that night. Something that required significantly more communication than whatever was happening before. Hendricks looked at the 3 documents together for a long time. He was not a man who jumped to conclusions. He was a man who sat with information until the information settled into something he trusted. "I'll take it up," he said. "I'm not promising anything on the response." The response came back from Alderman's office 4 hours later, a single paragraph that used the word speculative 3 times and premature twice, and concluded that expanding the operational boundary based on fragmentary signals intelligence and vehicle track analysis was not warranted at this time, given current resource allocation and weather conditions. It was a paragraph written by someone who had decided before reading that the conclusion would be no, and had then constructed language around that conclusion. Webb read it once, handed it back to Lim without a word. Lim folded it and put it in his pocket and went back to his imagery without changing his expression. Webb went to the perimeter. He stood there looking northeast, and a supply sergeant named Tarvo, who had been at the base for 2 years, wandered over and stood beside him without being invited, which Webb didn't mind because Tarvo was the kind of person whose presence didn't require management. "She was one of your unit?" Tarvo asked after a while. "Overwatch, yeah. I heard what they're saying, that she cracked." Webb said nothing. His jaw moved slightly, the way it did when he was choosing words carefully. "She grew up in Montana," he said eventually. Not because Tarvo had asked, but because it needed to be said to someone who would actually hear it. She used to talk about hunting with her father when she was a kid. She said the first thing he taught her was that you don't pull the trigger until you completely understand what you're looking at. The whole picture, every element. He paused. She's not someone who cracks under pressure. She's someone who sees the whole picture faster than anyone else in the room and then acts on it while everyone else is still processing. What picture did she see this time? Webb looked at the ridge. One nobody else was willing to look at. Tarvo nodded slowly. He stayed at the perimeter a while longer after Webb went inside, looking at the same mountains, and then he went back to his work, because that was all there was to do. On the first day, Maya moved the way she had been trained to move in terrain denial environments, with total sign discipline, stepping in frozen ground wherever possible, avoiding soft snow, using rock surfaces as a preference over any substrate that would hold a track. She moved at night when she could, because darkness was cover and cover was the primary resource she was managing. During daylight, she moved only when the alternative was to stop making progress entirely, and she moved in the lowest profile the terrain allowed, using every fold in the ground, every ridgeline, every shadow. She was burning calories faster than she was replacing them. The emergency pack had been designed for survival across a defined window, not for sustained solo operations in contested terrain, and there was a fundamental difference between those two purposes that she felt accumulating in her legs as the hours went on. Not weakness in the catastrophic sense. Her legs still worked, still climbed, still carried her up the grades that the terrain kept presenting, but a kind of deepening deficit that she could track by feel, a hollowness in the quads that appeared later in the effort now than it had appeared at the start. She ate what the pack specified in the portions it specified, And she did not think about the portions she was rationing around, because thinking about food when you can't have more food is an investment that pays nothing. The cold was the problem that required the most active management. She had the correct gear, cold weather-based layers, insulated shell, gloves rated to -20, but correct gear at -15 with sustained wind is still -15 with sustained wind, and there is a ceiling on what any manufactured material can do against sustained exposure at those temperatures. She moved to stay warm. When she stopped to observe, she found whatever windbreak the terrain offered, and she pressed herself into it and remained completely still until movement became necessary again. Stillness cost heat. Movement cost calories. She was constantly balancing one deficit against another. She was looking for coal. More precisely, she was looking for evidence of coal, the sign that an injured man moving through hostile terrain leaves behind, whether he intends to or not. Blood on snow was the obvious indicator, but blood froze fast and darkened to a color that blended with rock shadow at distance. She was looking for subtler things. Disturbed ground at natural rest points. Equipment or material. Boot prints in sheltered pockets where drifts hadn't fully filled. The quality of wrongness in a landscape that has been moved through by something human rather than by weather. On the afternoon of the second day, she found the first piece. A section of torn tactical fabric caught on a sharp edge of rock outcrop at the base of a narrow gully, 2 kilometers northeast of the explosion site. Dark green, cold weather uniform material. The tear was fresh, the edges were clean and unweathered, and there was a faint dark staining on the inner surface that she read immediately. She didn't touch it. She photographed it with the compact unit in her emergency pack, and she noted the direction the gully ran, and she kept moving. He had come through here. He had been injured but mobile. The direction was clear. She followed it. The gully opened onto a frozen plateau exposed to wind from every angle, and crossing it in daylight was a calculation she sat with for 40 minutes from cover before committing. The alternative routes added 3 hours minimum and took her away from the bearing she was tracking. She crossed in 11 minutes, moving fast between scattered boulders, dropping flat twice, when she heard engine sounds that resolved on the third, listening to something more consistent than wind in rock formations. Something mechanical, low speed, north of the plateau. She worked her way around the eastern tree line to a point with sightline on the northern approach without exposure, settled into observation posture, and watched. 2 vehicles. Military surplus trucks, older model, the kind that were ubiquitous in contested regions because they ran on mechanical simplicity rather than supply chains, moving northeast on ground that had been crossed enough times to leave a faint compression pattern in the frost. 8 fighters visible, 4 in the open bed of the second truck, 4 distributed across the cab configurations of both vehicles, armed. Moving with the directional certainty of people who know where they're going rather than people who are looking for somewhere to be. Moving northeast. The same direction her evidence was pointing. She watched them until they cleared the northern rise of the plateau. And then she sat back against a pine trunk and held the implications still in her mind long enough to look at them properly. The direction matched the fabric fragment, which meant coal was either ahead of those vehicles on the same bearing, or the vehicles were moving toward a location coal had been taken to, or she was imposing a pattern on unrelated data. She acknowledged the third possibility the way you acknowledge weather, as a fact of the environment that doesn't change what you're going to do, and filed it accordingly. She moved faster after that, not recklessly. Reckless was how you stepped on something you hadn't seen or walked into a position you hadn't cleared, but with more urgency, accepting a marginally higher risk profile in exchange for closing the distance before whatever was developing developed further. On the evening of the second day, she smelled wood smoke. She tracked it for 20 minutes before she located its source, a ravine cutting north to south through the ridgeline, a feature that hadn't shown clearly in the pre-mission terrain imagery because that imagery had been generated in summer, when different snow coverage and different shadow angles produced a different picture. 15 meters wide at the widest point, significantly deeper than the upper rim suggested, with a natural overhang at the southern end that created a sheltered pocket against the eastern wall. At the base of that overhang, the remnants of a fire. Coals, still pushing residual heat into the air above them when she held her hand close. She cleared the ravine in sections before she approached. Checked the upper rim. Checked the approach vectors. Checked the shadow under the overhang. Spent 6 minutes doing what a less patient person would have done in two, because a less patient person would have announced themselves to whoever had built that fire. The boot prints around the coal bed were clear. One set, military pattern sole, right foot bearing more weight than the left, which meant either a habitual gait asymmetry or a right side injury altering weight distribution. The prints moved from the north wall to the fire and then east, toward a gap in the rock face that she had missed on her initial scan because it was narrow enough to look like a shadow. She followed the prints to the gap. It was barely wide enough to pass through sideways. Beyond it, the rock opened into a shallow natural alcove. Not a true cave, more a concavity in the cliff face, 2 meters deep and perhaps 3 wide, sheltered from above by an overhang that had been accumulating the same lichen for what looked like decades. The kind of place that appeared on no map, and that you only found by following someone who had found it through necessity. He was sitting against the back wall with a weapon across his thighs and his eyes open. She recognized him before the details fully assembled. The build, the posture, the specific way he held himself even injured. Ethan Cole. Alive. His left forearm was dressed with strips of material that hadn't come from any medical kit she could identify, and a laceration along his hairline had bled substantially and dried in dark streaks down the left side of his face. He looked like someone who had survived something that should have been unsurvivable, which was accurate. His right hand moved toward the weapon before he registered her face in the dim light. The movement stopped. They looked at each other for a moment that had no particular length. "You're supposed to be at RV Alpha," Cole said. His voice was abraded, rough, the voice of someone who had been breathing cold, dry air for too long and talking to nobody. "So I've been told." Maya came through the gap and crouched to his level, running a systematic visual assessment. The dressing, the laceration, his color, the position of his right arm versus his left, the angle at which he was holding his torso. That last detail told her about the ribs before he said anything about them. "How bad is the arm?" "Worst of it. Fragment from the blast got through the sleeve. I think it's still in there." "Can you grip?" He tried. The muscles in his jaw tightened. Partially, not reliably. "Ribs?" 2, maybe 3. Right side. "Manageable if I don't do anything that requires full lung capacity. Define manageable." "I got here." She looked at the dressing. Applied tight. He'd been managing pain over circulation, which was the wrong priority but understandable given the available materials and the conditions under which he'd applied it. She didn't touch it yet. "How long in this position?" "Since yesterday morning. I moved after the blast. The sweep teams were working the corridor and staying wasn't an option. Took most of the night to find this." "You built a fire." Something crossed his face. Not quite embarrassment. The expression of a man who knows he made a calculated risk and isn't entirely certain the calculation was right. "Temperature was dropping." "I know. I'm not criticizing." She meant it. A fire was a risk, and it was also, at -18 with a fragment in your arm and cracked ribs and no resupply, potentially the correct risk. "I have a secondary radio, short range, but if we can reach the eastern ridgeline, we might get enough elevation to bounce a signal." "Maya." He said it differently than he said her rank. Lower. More direct. "The explosion on the southern approach, the suppression, that was you." Okafor and Webb needed time. "That's not..." He stopped. Reconsidered. "How many rounds did you have when you moved off Vega?" 40. "And you've been out here..." 51 hours at that point, 53 now." He was quiet, looking at her with the particular attention of someone doing an accurate assessment rather than a performative one. "Alderman has you down as AWOL," he said. "I assumed. He'll push for disciplinary, full process. It'll follow your record." "I know." "And you still..." He stopped a third time. The sentence kept running into something it couldn't get past. "You would have done the same," Maya said. Not warmly, just factually, the way you state something that doesn't require emotional framing because it's simply true. For any one of us. Don't make it something it isn't. He didn't argue it. She was right, and he knew she was right, and the shape of the silence after she said it was the shape of something being acknowledged rather than contested. "All right," Cole said. "What's the plan?" It wasn't quite a question. He was already shifting into a different mode. The mode she recognized from every operation she'd observed him run. where the personal dimension compressed and the tactical dimension expanded to fill the available space. It was, she thought, one of the things that made him good at what he did. She laid out the plan in precise, sequential terms. Route to the eastern ridgeline, 3 kilometers, grade ranging from moderate to steep, exposed section at the midpoint that would require careful timing. Estimated time given his mobility limitations, which she stated as a fact rather than an apology. Radio contact window she was targeting, and the backup window if the first didn't work. Contingencies for a blocked primary approach. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. The vehicles on the northern plateau, personnel count. 8 confirmed visible, possibly more in the cabs I couldn't see clearly. Direction of travel. Northeast. Consistent bearing with Lim's flagged facility if his analysis is correct. Cole's expression shifted in a way that she had learned to read as him processing information he didn't like. It's correct, he said. She looked at him. You know about the facility. I know it's not a supply depot. He spoke carefully, measuring the words as he placed them. When the sweep team found me in the corridor, before I got clear, I was close enough to catch fragments of their radio traffic. My language skills aren't deep enough for full comprehension, but some of it was unambiguous. They were reporting to a location northeast, and the response included a standing order. What order? Bring anyone alive. The cold in the alcove suddenly felt present in a different way. More intentional, somehow. That order was still active when I cleared the corridor, Cole continued, which means the sweep wasn't just a cleanup operation. They were looking for someone specifically, or for information, which amounts to the same thing. Maya sat back on her heels and worked through the full picture. The vehicles, the facility, the radio traffic spike that Lim's analysis had flagged, the coordinated encirclement that had been too precise to have been reactive, the intelligence assets who had been compromised before they ever made contact. All of it pointing in a direction that had a word for it, and the word was not comfortable. They knew we were coming, she said. Yes. The mission profile was compromised before we inserted. That's my read. His voice was level. Which means the facility northeast isn't just a militia base. It's connected to whoever accessed that profile. She looked at the gap in the rock face. Beyond it, the ravine, and beyond that, 40 kilometers of hostile mountain terrain, and somewhere along that terrain, a facility that appeared on no current map with a standing order to take prisoners and a direct line to intelligence that should have been compartmented. She had come out here to find one man. She was beginning to understand that finding him was the simplest element of what was developing. Can you move? She asked. Cole looked at his arm, looked at the wall, looked at her. Give me 5 minutes. She gave him 10. She used them to redistribute her pack, check her remaining ammunition, 31 rounds now, which was not enough for a sustained engagement, but was enough for several specific problems, and eat half of what was left of her rations, slowly, without pleasure, because the body required fuel regardless of the mind's current priorities. Cole got to his feet on the second attempt. He checked his weapon with the automatic thoroughness of someone whose hands had done it so many times, the sequence ran without conscious instruction. He was upright. I was functional. He was going to slow their movement by a significant margin, and they both knew it, and neither of them addressed it because it was simply the condition of the problem, and addressing conditions didn't change them. Maya went through the gap first. Cole followed. The ravine was in deep shadow now, the sun having dropped below the western ridgeline. The temperature already falling toward the range that nightfall would make genuinely dangerous. East ridgeline, she said, not looking back at him. Stay tight. Voss. His voice behind her. I've done mountain movement. I know you have. She kept moving. Stay tight anyway. He did. They moved northeast into the darkening terrain, 2 people against a mountain that had no opinion about their survival. And ahead of them, in a facility no one at Blackstone Forward Base was currently looking at, a standing order waited to be executed. The wind came from the north again, hard and flat, carrying the specific cold of altitude and open ground, and the last of the gray light dissolved from the sky the way it always did at that elevation. Not gradually, but all at once, like a decision being made. They moved for 2 hours before Cole's breathing told her what he wouldn't. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just slightly wrong. A fraction too controlled, too deliberate, the way a person breathes when every inhale requires a conscious decision to push through something that hurts. She had been listening to it for the past 40 minutes and cataloging it without comment, because commenting wouldn't change the physics of cracked ribs and altitude and a 3-kilometer climb in the dark. And Cole was the kind of man who performed better when you treated his limitations as logistics rather than vulnerabilities. They stopped at a natural shelf in the rock face, wide enough to sit on, sheltered from the north wind by a granite spur that jutted out at exactly the right angle. Maya crouched and checked their position on the compass bearing she'd been maintaining in her head since they left the ravine. They were 2/3 of the way to the eastern ridgeline. The final third was the steepest section, the exposed crossing she'd flagged in the plan, and it needed to be done in darkness, while the darkness was still full, rather than the thin gray pre-dawn that would start eroding their cover in a few hours. Cole sat on the shelf and didn't say anything for a moment. His right hand was pressed against his lower ribs. Not clutching, just maintaining pressure. A subconscious management of pain that he probably wasn't fully aware of. "Talk to me about the ribs," Maya said. "They're ribs. They hurt. Are you getting full breath?" A pause. Honest consideration rather than deflection. 80%, maybe 75 on the steeper grades. Any sharp pain on exhale? Some. That could mean a clean fracture, or it could mean something was pressing where it shouldn't be. She couldn't determine which without imaging she didn't have, and the distinction mattered less right now than the practical question of how far 75% lung capacity would carry him up the final grade. "There's a longer route," she said. "It adds 40 minutes, but it stays on moderate grade the whole way. How much longer to radio contact if we take it? An hour minimum, maybe more." He thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. "We take the direct route." She didn't argue. It was the right call. They rested for 8 minutes, long enough to be useful, short enough that the cold didn't win, and then they moved again. Maya set the pace at the bottom of the final grade, slightly slower than she would have moved alone, calibrated to what she'd observed from Cole over the past 2 hours. He didn't comment on the pace. He just climbed. The exposed section took 11 minutes. The wind came at them sideways across the rock face, the kind of wind that doesn't gust but simply exists at a constant brutal pressure, and the footing was mixed. Solid granite alternating with patches of ice over loose stone that had to be tested before each step. Cole slipped once, caught himself on his right arm, and made a sound that he immediately suppressed. Maya was 2 meters ahead, and she stopped and waited without turning around, because turning around would have been the wrong gesture. "Still with you," he said. "I know." She kept climbing. They reached the ridgeline at 0340 hours. The eastern face dropped away below them into darkness, a sweep of invisible terrain that the stars only faintly illuminated, and the wind up here was different. Not the sideways pressure of the exposed face, but a clean, cold current running along the ridge from north to south that was almost pleasant compared to what they'd come through. Maya pulled the secondary radio from her pack. She extended the antenna fully, oriented it based on the bearing to Blackstone forward base, and keyed it. "Blackstone, this is Voss. Any element, come in." Static. She waited 15 seconds and tried again, adjusting the antenna angle by 5 degrees. "Blackstone, this is Sergeant Maya Voss, broadcasting from Eastern Corvan Ridge. Request immediate response." The static shifted. Not resolved. Shifted. Changed in texture, which sometimes meant a signal was bouncing somewhere in the right direction. She adjusted again and held the radio higher. A voice came back. Fragmentary. Broken by terrain and distance, but a voice. She caught 3 words clearly. Her name, a question mark implied by the tone, and the word confirm. "Blackstone, confirming identity. Voss, Maya, Sergeant First Class. I have Captain Cole. He is injured but mobile. We need extraction coordinates and a contact window. Respond." The static surged and then a different voice came through. Cleaner, more direct, with the particular urgency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this transmission. She caught, "Copy your traffic. Stand by for secure authentication." She reached into her emergency pack for the authentication card. Ran through the protocol. Transmitted the day code. A longer pause. 30 seconds. Then the voice came back cleaner. Not clear, but cleaner, enough to work with. She caught the essential elements. They were copying her signal. They were scrambling a response. She needed to maintain this position and transmit again in 40 minutes on the same frequency. She lowered the radio. Cole was sitting against the rock just below the ridge crest, his back to the eastern face, maintaining the minimum profile above the ridge line. He had been watching her work the radio with an expression she recognized, the expression of a commander who is temporarily not in command and is handling it by focusing on specifics rather than the general situation. "Did they copy?" he asked. "Enough. 40 minutes for the next window." He nodded. "The facility. Tell me what you're thinking." She sat down against the rock beside him, close enough that their combined body heat was a factor, which at this temperature was simply pragmatic. Lim flagged it from vehicle movement and signals traffic. 8 years decommissioned, but active. The radio spike the night of the 14th correlates with our contact window. Something changed when the operation went active. My read is the facility is a command node, not a forward fighting position. Too much comms traffic for a militia camp. Command node for what? For whoever had our mission profile. Cole was quiet for a moment. The wind ran along the ridge between them. "There were 2 people in that safe house," he said slowly. "The intelligence assets." "Yes." "How much did they know about the mission parameters?" Maya looked at him. She had run this thread herself and had not liked where it ended. "The exfil route, the timing window, possibly the team composition. That's not information the assets should have had." "No, it isn't." Another silence. Longer. "Someone gave it to them," Cole said. "Or to someone connected to them. Or the assets were the leak and the safe house was the mechanism." She said it plainly, because the alternative was talking around it, and talking around things was a luxury for people who had time. The militia was waiting. They had the corridor pre-positioned and the approach routes boxed before we were on target. That's not reactive. That's anticipatory. They knew our grid, our timing, and our approach vectors. Cole's expression was not anger. It was something harder and colder than anger. "I want to know what's in that facility." "So do I." She paused. 40 kilometers. With this arm. And the ribs. He looked at the sky above them. The stars, dense and very bright at this altitude. The kind of sky you only got when the atmosphere was thin and the air was absolutely clear. He looked at it the way people look at things when they're not really seeing them, when the visible thing is just a surface they're thinking against. "We get extracted," he said. "We get back to base. And then I take this to someone who isn't Alderman." She waited. "Because if Alderman's intel section had that facility in their picture and sat on it, then we have a problem that goes above the operational level. And if they didn't have it, then we have a different problem." He shifted his back against the rock. "Either way, this doesn't stop with us getting back to base. Someone is going to answer for what happened in that corridor." She said nothing. She was looking northeast in the direction of the facility, in the direction of the vehicles that had been moving toward it, in the direction of the standing order she couldn't stop thinking about. Bring anyone alive. Not anyone. Someone specific. The 40 minutes passed in a cold that was absolute and a silence that was almost companionable, which surprised her slightly. She had been in the field with Cole enough times to know how he operated under stress, but she had never been in quite this specific configuration. Injured, isolated, operating well outside any sanctioned boundary. And she had not known until now that he was the kind of person who could be quiet without it being a weight on the surrounding air. She keyed the radio at exactly the 40-minute mark. The signal came back faster this time, cleaner. And the voice on the other end was one she recognized, which was unexpected enough that she pulled the radio slightly away from her ear and then put it back. "Lim." "Voss, this is Lim. I'm on the secure relay. Are you reading me?" "Reading you. You're on the relay?" "Hendricks let me run it. He's standing by." "Voss, we have a problem at this end." "What kind of problem?" "Alderman is moving to close the search parameters entirely. He's citing resource allocation and weather assessment. The recovery operation is being formally stood down as of 0600 this morning." She checked her watch. "That was 78 minutes from now." "What does that mean for extraction?" A pause. She could hear Lim working something on his end. Keys, maybe, or the sound of someone moving quickly in a confined space. "It means any extraction request coming through standard channels goes across Alderman's desk, and he has the authority to deny it, which he will." "What about non-standard channels?" Another pause. Longer. "I've been looking at that question for about 6 hours, actually." "And?" "There's a liaison officer from Directorate 7 at this base. He arrived yesterday afternoon. Name is Carver. He's been asking questions about the mission that Alderman's staff haven't been particularly interested in answering. Lim's voice dropped slightly, not in volume, but in register. He asked specifically about the facility. Maya was very still. The northeastern facility. He had coordinates that matched Maya's analysis. He already had them, Voss, before I built the overlay. He came in with them. Cole had been listening. She could tell by the angle of his head, the stillness of it. She held the radio slightly away from her ear so he could hear the transmission. Lim, Cole said. This is Cole. Talk to me about Carver. A beat of silence on Lim's end that probably contained some version of shock quickly managed. Captain, you're... Okay. Carver, Directorate 7 liaison. He's been here approximately 16 hours. He hasn't spoken to Alderman directly as far as I can tell. He's been talking to Hendricks. He knows about the signals traffic, and he has the facility coordinates, and he's been asking about mission personnel, specifically about who was on Overwatch, Cole said. Yes, sir. Cole and Maya looked at each other. Get me Carver, Cole said. Right now. Whatever relay you need to build. The transmission with Carver lasted 9 minutes and covered ground that neither Maya nor Cole had fully anticipated. Carver spoke in the clipped, precise diction of someone who had been briefed to a level that created as many questions as it answered, and he shared information with the selective economy of a man who gave you what you needed to act on and retained the rest. The facility had a designation in Directorate 7's operational database that dated back 4 years. It had been flagged as a potential intelligence node during a surveillance operation that had subsequently been closed, Carver said, over his team's objections. The objections had been overruled at a level above Directorate 7 by someone whose name he did not transmit on an unsecured relay. The facility had gone dark in their tracking for 18 months. The night of March 14th, it had gone active again. What activated it? Maya asked. The mission, Carver said. Your mission. The extraction request for the 2 assets. Cole's voice was very quiet. The assets triggered it. The assets were never what they presented as, Carver said. We believe they were inserted into the safe house position specifically to generate an extraction request and expose the mission parameters of whatever team responded. The cold on the ridgeline was the same cold it had been a minute ago. It felt different. And the mission profile was pulled from our system, Cole said. It wasn't a question. The encirclement was too precise for anything else. We're working on the access point. We haven't closed it yet. How many people in that facility? Current estimate is 40 to 60 personnel. It's a compound structure, original border installation plus additions. There's a detention element for prisoners. The standing order you intercepted is consistent with an intelligence extraction operation. They want someone who was on that mission, someone who saw or heard something they need to contain. Maya looked northeast without moving her head. 40 to 60 personnel, a detention element, a standing order that was still active. Carver, she said, what's your extraction capacity? I have 2 birds on standby at a staging area 80 kilometers from your position. They're waiting on a confirmation from me and a viable landing zone. Why haven't you moved them already? A pause. The honest kind. Because Alderman has operational authority over this airspace, and I don't have the standing to override him without a confirmed recovery target, which I now have. You're going to have a problem with the timeline, Cole said. He's standing down the recovery operation at 0600. I know, which is why I need your coordinates in the next 30 minutes, and I need you to find me a landing zone within 2 kilometers of your current position. Maya was already thinking about the terrain below the eastern face. She had crossed it in her approach to the ridgeline, or rather, she had skirted its lower section, enough to form a rough picture. There's a plateau feature approximately 1.4 kilometers east-southeast of my current position. I didn't cross it, but I can see the profile from here. It looks viable. I need a visual confirmation. I'll get you one. Voss. Carver's voice shifted slightly. What I'm about to ask isn't in the extraction request. She waited. The facility. If you can get eyes on it before the birds come to you. If you can give me a current layout, personnel distribution, anything that tells me what's in the detention element, that information changes what I can authorize on the recovery. Cole looked at her. She looked back at him. How much does it change? Cole asked. Significantly. Cole said nothing for a moment. He was doing the calculation, the same one she was doing, the one that weighed the risk profile of two people, one of them with a fragment in his arm and cracked ribs, moving toward a compound with 40 to 60 armed personnel, against the value of whatever Carver's significantly meant in operational terms. "Give me the facility grid," Cole said. Carver gave it. It was 11 kilometers northeast. In the dark, on this terrain, with Cole's current mobility, that was a 4-hour movement minimum. "We get you your reconnaissance," Cole said. "You get us out of this mountain." "Agreed. 30-minute check-ins starting now. If I lose contact for more than 45 minutes, I'm moving the birds to your last known position." "Copy that." The transmission ended. Maya lowered the radio and looked at Cole. He was already getting to his feet, moving with the careful efficiency of someone who has accepted the inventory of their physical limitations and is working within it. 11 kilometers, she said. "I heard. 4 hours minimum." "I heard that too." He checked his weapon, seated the magazine. "What's your ammunition at?" 31 rounds. "I have 22. 53 rounds between them against a compound with 40 to 60 personnel, and they were not going in to fight. They were going in to look, which was a different and, in some ways, harder discipline. Looking required getting close. Getting close required not being seen. Not being seen required the kind of patience and precision that was harder to sustain when your body was running on a caloric deficit and your ribs were making every breath a negotiation. She picked up her pack. "We need to move." They moved. The 11 kilometers took 4 hours and 20 minutes, which was close enough to the estimate that it was essentially accurate, but the 20 minutes came from 2 route deviations that the terrain imposed without consulting the plan. A frozen stream bed that had looked crossable on the approach and wasn't, and a ridgeline feature that turned out to be significantly more vertical on the northern face than the profile suggested from a distance. They lost the 20 minutes finding alternate lines through both problems, and it cost them, but they found the lines and they kept moving. Cole's breathing got worse on the 3rd hour. Not critically. She tracked it constantly, running the assessment on a background loop while the front of her attention managed the route. But the deficit dropped from 75% to something closer to 65, and she could hear the difference. He didn't slow his pace. She noted that and said nothing about it. They spoke very little on the movement, not because the silence was uncomfortable, but because silence was correct. Voices carried at night in still mountain air, and the terrain they were moving through was increasingly likely to have eyes in it. She communicated by hand signal when she needed to communicate at all. Cole read them without hesitation, which was the kind of thing that didn't require comment, but that she noticed anyway. At the 4-hour mark, she called the check-in with Carver, transmitting in short bursts minimum time on the air. He confirmed the birds were still on standby. He confirmed Alderman had not yet moved the formal stand-down order. I gave her a single piece of additional intelligence. Thermal imagery from an asset she didn't ask about that showed the facility compound in rough outline, including 2 external guard positions, and what appeared to be a vehicle staging area on the southern approach. "The detention element," she said. "Location in the compound. Northern building, separate structure from the main facility, single story, reinforced." "How do you know it's detention?" "Because we've seen this configuration before," Carver said, and the way he said it closed the question. She ended the transmission and kept moving. The facility appeared at the 4-hour 20 mark, in the way that things appear in mountains at night, not gradually but suddenly, as the terrain shifted and a new angle of view opened up, and there it was, below and ahead, 300 meters, lit by a combination of generator-powered external lighting and whatever was burning in the central compound. She went flat immediately. Cole went flat beside her without being told. They lay on frozen ground on a slight rise above the facility and looked at it for a long time before either of them said anything. It was larger than the former border installation that had been the original structure. Additions had been made to the north and east, newer construction in a different material that stood out in the ambient light as a slightly different shade of dark. The perimeter was defined by a combination of chain-link fencing and vehicle placement, trucks, and a larger vehicle that might have been an armored personnel carrier positioned to cover the southern and western approaches. External lighting was inconsistent, which was both a problem and an opportunity. There were shadows. "Guard rotation," Cole said quietly. Not a question, an instruction. She watched, counted, watched again. Southern perimeter, 2 personnel, rotating on approximately 20-minute intervals. Eastern face, I see one static position. The northern building has a single post outside the main door. She paused. The post outside the northern building isn't rotating. He's been there the whole time we've been watching. Which means there's something inside worth posting a permanent guard on. Yes. She had the compact digital unit out, was documenting what she could see, compound layout, guard positions, vehicle placement, building dimensions as best she could estimate from elevation and angle. It wasn't the kind of systematic reconnaissance that a full team with proper equipment would produce. It was the kind that two people in degraded condition on a frozen ridgeline could produce, which was still something, and something was what Carver needed. She transmitted the documentation in compressed bursts over 3 transmissions, each under 90 seconds on the air. Carver acknowledged each. On the third acknowledgement, he said something that changed the temperature of the conversation. Voss, the detention element. We have reason to believe there is currently a live subject inside. She looked at Cole. Cole's jaw was tight. One of ours? She asked. Unknown. The signal's traffic suggests an intelligence extraction in progress. If there's a live subject they're running a protocol on, the window is… Carver stopped, reorganized. The window is not long. How not long? Hours, not days. She looked at the northern building, the single guard at the door, the light in the window. Not bright, but consistent, the kind of light that came from something being used rather than something being left on. Carver, Cole said, what are you authorizing? I'm authorizing extraction of the live subject if a viable approach presents itself without compromising your extraction. You're asking 2 people with 53 rounds between them to… I'm authorizing it if it presents itself. I am not ordering it. Carver's voice was precise. The decision is yours, Captain. Cole was quiet for a moment. He looked at the compound, at the northern building, at the guard at the door, at the shadows between the lighting installations. At Maya. What do you think? He asked. The question surprised her, not because it was wrong, but because Cole didn't usually ask. He assessed, decided, directed. The asking was different. It was the question of a man who was running on 60-something% lung capacity with a metal fragment in his arm and who was honest enough with himself to know it. She looked at the compound again, measured everything she could measure from 300 meters in the dark. The guard rotation has a gap, she said. Southern perimeter, when they cross at the midpoint, there's approximately 40 seconds where the eastern approach is unwatched from that position. The eastern face has one static post, but the position is oriented south. If the approach comes from the northeast is exposed from the main building's upper windows. For 11 seconds, between the vehicle staging area and the fence line, 11 seconds of exposure. Cole looked at her. She looked back at him. That's a very narrow margin, he said. Yes. With your ammunition and my arm. Yes. And we still need to get out of this mountain after. Yes, she said. All of that is true. He looked at the compound one more time, at the light in the northern building window, at the guard at the door. How confident are you in the 11 seconds? He asked. She had measured it 4 times in her head from 4 different reference points and gotten the same answer each time. Confident. He exhaled, slow, controlled. The breath of someone making a decision that they cannot unmake once it's made. Then we go, Cole said. She was already mapping the approach in her head. Every step of it, every decision point, every contingency that branched off every contingency. She knew what this was. She knew exactly what this was, and what it cost and what it would require. She stood up into a crouch and checked her weapon one final time. Behind them, the mountain was silent. Ahead, the compound threw its inconsistent light into the dark, and in the northern building, behind a reinforced door with a single guard posted outside it, something was happening that couldn't wait for morning. The guard lit a cigarette. The orange tip flared once in the dark. Maya watched the eastern shadow line and started counting. The guard's cigarette traced a slow arc in the dark as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, bored in the particular way that people get bored when they've been standing in the same spot for too long and nothing has happened and nothing seems like it's going to happen. Maya watched the arc, watched the rhythm of it, watched the moment his eyes tracked the ember rather than the perimeter. She moved, The northeastern approach was 11 seconds of exposure between the vehicle staging area and the fence line, and she had counted it 4 times in her head and gotten the same number each time. And now she was inside those 11 seconds and counting them for real, which was a different experience entirely. Not faster or slower than the mental rehearsal, but more textured, more specific. The frozen ground transmitting information through her boots about every surface she crossed, the wind a constant low pressure against her left side, the compound lights resolving from ambient glow into distinct sources as she closed the distance. 8 seconds. 9. She reached the fence line and pressed herself against it, and the 11 seconds ended and the guard was still looking at his cigarette. She stayed motionless for 30 seconds. Behind her, at the edge of the vehicle staging area, Cole was waiting. She'd left him there with clear instructions. He covered the southern approach, and he did not move until she signaled, and if the operation went loud before the signal, he moved to the extraction point and called Carver's birds, and he did not come in after her. He had agreed to those terms without argument, which told her his ribs were worse than 75%. The fence line ran north along the eastern face of the compound. She moved along it low and deliberate, using the vehicle shadows where they extended far enough to be useful, closing the distance to the northern building in increments small enough that each one was separately deniable. If the guard looked, he would see nothing because there was nothing yet to see, and then there would be nothing, and then there would be nothing. And by the time there was something, it would be too late for the guard's reaction to matter. She reached the corner of the northern building. The guard at the door was 6 meters away. Young. She could see that now, close enough to make out detail. Younger than she'd expected, with the posture of someone who had been standing for a long time and whose mind had drifted away from the immediate task. His weapon was slung rather than held. His attention was inward. She came around the corner in a movement that prioritized silence over speed, which meant it took 3 seconds longer than it might have and covered less ground, and she crossed the 6 meters in the gap between one of the guard's slow blinks and the next. And she put him down with a controlled application of force to the back of the skull that was precise enough to render him unconscious without being lethal, which was the harder standard to hit and the one that mattered for what came next. He went down without a sound. She caught his weight before it hit the ground and lowered him in sections. She tried the door, locked. Single deadbolt, keyed from outside. She found the key on the guard's belt, second ring, standard issue pattern, and had the door open in 4 seconds. The interior of the northern building was a single room divided by a partition wall that had been added after the original construction. She could tell by the way the materials didn't match, the newer drywall against the old stone. The front section was an anteroom with a table and 2 chairs and a lamp that had been knocked over at some point and never righted. The partition had a door in it, hollow core, no lock. She went through it. The back section was smaller, windowless, a single overhead fixture. And in the center of the room, zip-tied to a metal chair that had been bolted to the floor, was a man she had never seen before. He was conscious. Mid-40s, maybe older. The condition he was in made the estimate difficult. He had the lean, deliberately nondescript appearance of someone who had once invested effort in being forgettable, now rendered unforgettable by what had been done to him over however many hours he'd been in this chair. His eyes tracked her the moment she entered, sharp and immediate despite everything else, which told her something important about what was underneath the damage. She held up a hand, palm out. The same gesture Cole had used in the safe house, and she thought of that involuntarily. The distance between that moment and this one measured in days, but feeling like a different dimension entirely. "I'm getting you out," she said quietly. "Don't make any noise." The man looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not relief exactly. More like someone running a verification process before committing to a response. "Who sent you?" he asked. His voice was rough but controlled. "Carver. Director at 7. Something shifted in his face. The verification process completing. "ID." She gave him her service number and last 3 authentication digits. He closed his eyes for a half second and opened them. "Took you long enough," he said. She cut the zip ties. Getting him out took longer than getting in had, because he could walk but not fast and not silently. His left knee had been worked on in a way she didn't look at directly when she was cutting the ties, and every step on it produced an involuntary sound that she managed by having him press his forearm against his mouth, during the movements through exposed sections. It wasn't elegant. It was also functional, which was the only standard that applied. They made the fence line, made the northeastern exposure, made the 11 seconds in 14 because his knee cost them 3, and the guard rotation was at the 18-minute mark of its 20-minute cycle, and they had 2 minutes of margin when they cleared the eastern face. She signaled Cole with a single low click on the radio. 2 seconds later, his shadow separated from the vehicle staging area and moved toward them. He saw the man she was supporting and didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the man the way you look at something that changes the shape of what you thought you understood. "Can you move?" Cole asked him. "Slower than you want." "That's most people in these mountains." Cole shifted to the man's other side, took some of his weight off Maya, despite the fact that taking weight with his left arm cost him something visible in his face. "What's your name?" "Sarek." "That a first or last name?" "Currently, it's the only one." Cole looked at Maya over Sarek's head. She looked back. Neither of them pressed it. They moved northeast away from the compound, putting distance between themselves and the perimeter before Sarek's absence was discovered, which would happen when the guard rotation completed and someone checked the post outside the northern building. At the current rotation interval, they had somewhere between 6 and 14 minutes before the alarm state changed. They had covered 400 meters when they heard it. Not an alarm in the traditional sense, no siren, but the compound's ambient sound shifting, voices suddenly audible at a volume and urgency that meant someone had found the guard. She heard a vehicle engine start. "Faster," she said. They went faster. Sarek's jaw was tight, and his breathing was audible, but he moved, because the alternative to moving was not an option that any of them were willing to name. She keyed the radio. "Carver, we have 3 for extraction. LZ confirmation. The plateau feature 1.4 east-southeast of my last transmitted position. We need the birds moving now." "Birds are moving," Carver said. "ETA 22 minutes to your LZ. We'll be there." Behind them, the vehicle engine grew louder for a moment and then shifted direction, moving south along the compound's western perimeter, which was the wrong direction. Either the response team was disoriented about which way the breach had gone, or they were covering the obvious route and assuming the extraction would head west toward the main ridgeline. Both possibilities bought time, and time was the resource they needed most. The plateau was 1.5 kilometers from the compound. On flat ground in good conditions, that was 18 minutes of comfortable movement. On the terrain they were crossing, with Cole's ribs and Sarek's knee, and the darkness, and the frozen ground, it was 26, and they made it in 24 by taking a line that was harder on the legs but more direct, cutting across 2 frozen drainage features that Cole crossed by stepping, and Maya crossed by jumping, and Sarek crossed by doing something in between that involved a sound he immediately suppressed and then kept moving anyway. They heard the helicopters before they saw them. The specific low frequency of rotors in cold mountain air coming from the southeast, and the sound of it did something to the air around all 3 of them that was not something any of them commented on. The birds came in without lights. 2 aircraft, landing in sequence, the first touching down on the eastern edge of the plateau, and the second holding a hover 40 meters out. The door of the first aircraft opened before the skids fully settled, and 2 people came out in the crouch run of people who have done this in this specific way many times before. One of them was carrying a medical kit. They reached Maya, and the 2 men and the medic went immediately to Sarek without being directed, which meant Carver had transmitted the condition assessment she'd given in her last check-in. The second extraction personnel took Cole's other side without ceremony, assessing his arm and his breathing in the same motion, and said something into his headset that Maya didn't catch. "Voss?" One of the extraction team was addressing her. A woman, compact, with the particular kind of eye contact that meant she had read a file. "You're Voss?" "Yes." "Carver wants you on his net as soon as we're airborne. He said to tell you the timeline moved." "What timeline?" "The stand-down order. Alderman pushed it up. It went through at 05 Tuniri." Maya looked at her watch. It was 05:41. "We were already outside the window," the woman said. It wasn't an apology. It was information. "I know." They loaded. The first aircraft took Sarek and the medic and Cole, and Maya watched Cole climb in with the assistance of the extraction personnel, watched him settle against the aircraft's interior wall, and close his eyes for a moment before opening them again. and the door closed and the aircraft lifted. She was in the second aircraft before it fully processed that she was leaving the mountain. The plateau dropped away below her. The Corvan Ridge spread out in the gray pre-dawn light, enormous, indifferent, beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when they're trying to kill you and you survive them anyway. She looked at it through the aircraft window until it was too dark and too far to see clearly, and then she looked at the floor of the aircraft instead. The radio crackled, Carver's voice. "Good work, Voss." She thought about what to say to that and decided on nothing, because nothing was accurate. Blackstone Forward Base received them at 0634 hours. The medical bay took Cole and Sarek simultaneously, Cole to the surgical suite for the fragment in his arm, which turned out to be 2 fragments rather than 1, and which required 40 minutes of work to locate and remove, and Sarek to a separate room with a door that closed and stayed closed, which meant he was either in critical condition or in a conversation that required privacy, and she suspected the latter. Maya sat in the corridor outside the medical bay and waited. She had been awake for 71 hours. She was aware of this in the specific way that extreme exhaustion makes you aware of time, not as a continuous experience, but as a series of discrete frames, each one present and then gone, the transitions between them blurring in a way that wasn't quite sleep. She was still in her field gear. Her boots were leaving a faint pattern of dried mud on the corridor floor. She had her weapon in her pack and the secondary radio and 31 rounds of ammunition that she hadn't fired during the compound operation, which she was still processing as a fact. That she had gone into a compound with 40 to 60 armed personnel and come out without firing a single shot, which was either the best possible outcome or a data point about margins she preferred not to examine too closely. She was still sitting there when Alderman found her. He came down the corridor with 2 of his staff and the specific forward-weighted walk of a man who has decided how a conversation is going to go before it begins. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a moment, at the gear, the mud, the state of her generally, and his expression was the expression of a man who is angry in a way that is looking for an official container to go into. "On your feet, Sergeant." She stood, not quickly, at the pace her body allowed after 71 hours, which was functional but not sharp. "Do you understand what you've done?" he said. The question was not looking for an answer. "You ignored a direct evacuation order. You went AWOL into hostile territory. You conducted an unauthorized operation against a compound in a sector that was not within our operational boundary. She also brought back your missing captain," a voice said from behind Alderman. Alderman turned. Carver was walking down the corridor from the direction of the closed room. He was shorter than his voice suggested, compact, with the kind of stillness in his movement that came from long practice at being underestimated. He was carrying a tablet, and he was looking at Alderman with the patient expression of a man who has had this category of conversation before and knows exactly where it goes. "Mr. Carver," Alderman said, "this is an internal disciplinary matter. It's a matter I have some standing in, actually." Carver stopped at a comfortable conversational distance. Not aggressive. Positioned. "Sergeant Voss's actions over the past 72 hours produced 3 outcomes that your command structure failed to produce. She located Captain Cole. She extracted a Directorate 7 asset, whose operational value I'm not going to characterize in this corridor. And she delivered reconnaissance on a facility that has been active for 4 years, and that was not in your threat mapping." He paused. "I'd like to understand which of those outcomes you're filing the disciplinary action against." Alderman's color changed, not dramatically. He was a controlled man, in the way that men who have operated behind desks for long enough become controlled, where the control is about appearance rather than content. "She violated protocol. She operated outside the boundary your command established. Yes. The boundary that excluded a facility that was running an intelligence extraction operation on an asset with access to Directorate 7 compartments." Carver's voice was the same temperature throughout. No emphasis, no edge. Just the flat delivery of facts that didn't need decoration. "I'll be filing a full report with the Oversight Board. The report will note that Sergeant Voss's initiative was the reason the operation succeeded and the reason Captain Cole is currently in your surgical suite rather than in a missing person file. The Oversight Board has no authority over operational decisions made in..." "Colonel," Carver said it in a way that stopped Alderman mid-sentence without being loud. "The asset Sergeant Voss extracted tonight had been in that facility for 9 hours. He was running an intelligence protocol that, if completed, would have compromised 3 active operations in this region and identified 6 embedded personnel by name. He held Alderman's gaze. 9 hours. The stand-down order you filed at Yo 520 this morning would have ensured that nobody reached him in time. He let that sit for a moment. I'd suggest that's a conversation worth having with the oversight board before they come to you. The corridor was quiet. One of Alderman's staff was looking at the floor. The other one was looking at Carver with an expression that was difficult to read, but leaned toward something like relief. Alderman looked at Maya. The look of a man recalibrating a position in real time, which was a thing he was not accustomed to doing and which showed. The AWOL designation will be reviewed, he said finally. I'd appreciate that, Carver said, and I'd appreciate Sergeant Voss's access being restored in the interim. She's going to be part of the debrief process. Alderman turned and walked back up the corridor without further comment. His staff followed, one of them glancing back once before the corner took them. Carver looked at Maya. How are you doing? I've been awake for 71 hours. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. I'm functional. Cole's surgery went well. They got both fragments. He'll be out of the surgical suite in about 20 minutes. He paused. You should eat something before the debrief. When's the debrief? 2 hours. Gives you time. He started back toward the closed room, then stopped. Voss, the 11-second window on the northeastern approach. How did you clock it? She thought about it. Observation. I counted it 4 times from the ridge line. In the dark, at 300 meters. The lighting was inconsistent but sufficient for sightline calculation. Carver looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Right, he said, and went back to his room. She found the mess hall and she sat down and she ate, mechanically, without tasting it, because Carver was right, and food was a system requirement and she was going to need to be functional in 2 hours. Webb found her there. He came through the mess hall door and stopped when he saw her, and for a moment he just stood there, which was not something Webb typically did. Then he walked over and sat down across from her and looked at her face. You look terrible, he said. Yeah. Cole's going to be okay? That's what they're saying. He was quiet for a moment. The guy you brought out, who is he? I don't know yet. But it matters. It matters a lot. She drank some water. Lim's analysis was right. The facility was exactly what he said it was. Webb absorbed that. He's going to want to hear that. Where is he? Intel section. He hasn't left it in about 18 hours. He paused. He was trying to build a case for a recovery operation that Alderman would authorize. He was still working it when Carver's birds came back. She thought about Lim sitting in the Intel section at 0541 in the morning, still building the case, still working the problem. She thought about what that looked like from the outside and what it cost on the inside. Tell him it mattered, she said. What he built. It mattered. Tell him yourself. I will, after the debrief. Webb leaned back in his chair. He looked at the table and then at her. Alderman came by the Intel section last night, looking for the terrain analysis Lim was running. He wanted it pulled from the system. Maya looked up from her food. Hendricks told him it was an in-progress product and couldn't be pulled without a formal request through the documentation process, which is technically true and also takes about 48 hours to complete. Webb's expression was neutral. Lim backed up everything to 3 separate locations before Hendricks even finished the sentence. She looked at him for a moment. Hendricks knew. Hendricks is smarter than he looks, which is saying something because he looks pretty smart. He paused. Alderman's going to push back on this. Whatever Carver's saying in that room, Alderman has institutional gravity and he's going to use it. Carver has the asset. The asset who nobody here is allowed to know exists. For now, she ate the last of what was on her plate. It won't stay that way. What makes you sure? She thought about Sarek in the chair in the northern building, zip-tied and damaged and still running a verification process before he committed to trusting her. About the file that Carver had clearly read before the birds went up. About the way Carver had positioned himself in that corridor with the flat, patient delivery of a man who was holding a better hand than anyone could currently see. Because whatever Sarek knows, she said, is the reason they kept him alive instead of just eliminating him. Which means it's the kind of information that survives the person carrying it, and that kind of information doesn't stay in a closed room forever. Webb thought about that. You think it goes up the chain? I think it's already going up the chain. I think that's why Carver was already here when we came off the mountain. He was quiet for a moment. The mess hall was largely empty at this hour. A few people at the far end, a cook moving behind the service line, the ambient sound of a large building running at reduced capacity. For what it's worth, Webb said, what Alderman put in your file? The AWOL designation, the emotional response notation. He stopped. It's in the file. Yeah, it's in the file. It'll get reviewed. That's not... He stopped again, looked at the table. I told him you weren't someone who cracks. In that meeting, the morning after. I told him what you'd done and he looked at me like I was making excuses for a subordinate who'd lost her head. She looked at him, at the specific quality of discomfort on his face, which was the discomfort of a man who had done what he could and found it insufficient. You told him the truth, she said. What he did with it is on him. I know, it's still... He shook his head. It still sits wrong. It does, she agreed. It'll sit wrong for a while, and then the file will get corrected and it'll sit differently. You sound pretty sure. I'm very tired, she said, and I might be wrong, but I don't think I am. He almost smiled. Not quite. Get some sleep before the debrief. I have 2 hours. Voss, sleep. She left the mess hall and found a bunk in the temporary quarters and lay down in her base layers because taking the rest of the gear off required more coordination than she currently had, and it didn't seem worth it. The bunk was narrow, and the mattress was the standard military issue mattress, which was designed for serviceability rather than comfort, and it was the best surface she had been horizontal on in 71 hours, and she was asleep in under 4 minutes. The debrief lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes, and happened in a room with 4 people in it, Maya, Carver, Hendricks, and a woman named Solis, who had arrived on a separate aircraft at some point during the morning and who had introduced herself with a title that meant something specific in the Directorate 7 hierarchy, without being a title that appeared on any organizational chart Maya had ever seen. Cole was not in the debrief. He was still in recovery from the surgery, conscious but grounded by the medical staff, which was probably the correct decision medically, and was certainly the decision he would have argued against if he'd been given the opportunity. Sarek was not in the debrief either. He was in the closed room with a different team, and the content of that debrief was not something Maya was cleared to know, which she accepted because it was the correct operational posture and because she had enough to work with from her own 72 hours. The debrief was thorough. Solis ran it with the precise, unhurried methodology of someone who knew exactly what information she needed and in exactly what sequence, and she asked questions that started at the beginning and moved forward without skipping anything, circling back periodically to specific moments with follow-up questions that told Maya what Solis was looking for without Solis ever stating it directly. She was building a timeline, a detailed, documented, provable timeline of what had happened, in what order, and who had made which decisions at which points. The kind of timeline that was constructed when someone intended to use it as the basis for something more formal. 2 hours into the debrief, Solis put her pen down and looked at Maya. The mission profile was compromised before insertion, Solis said. We've established that. I want to understand your read on when the decision was made to use the safe house as the mechanism. The assets had the exfil route, Maya said. That's not information they needed for their own extraction. They needed to be ready to move, not to know the specific route the extraction team was taking. The fact that they had it suggests it was passed to them deliberately, as bait. Bait for what? For whichever team responded to the extraction request. The militia needed a mission profile, not ours specifically. They needed whatever team showed up. The safe house was designed to generate a target-rich extraction event that could be ambushed and exploited. And the object was to capture rather than eliminate. The standing order was clear: bring anyone alive. That's an intelligence objective, not a security objective. They weren't trying to neutralize a threat. They were trying to acquire someone who had information they needed. Or to acquire the capability to do so, Solis said, to demonstrate to whoever was watching that they could intercept and capture Blackstone Division operators. Maya hadn't taken the analysis that far. She took it there now, in real time, and followed it to where it led. A proof of capability. For a buyer, Solis said, or a partner. Someone who needed to know the interception was possible before they committed to a larger arrangement. The room was quiet for a moment. Sarek, Maya said, He was the proof. They needed someone from Directorate 7 to demonstrate the capability to whoever they were demonstrating it to. Solis didn't confirm or deny. She picked up her pen. Continue. The last hour of the debrief moved through the compound approach and the extraction with the same methodical precision as the earlier sections. And when it ended, Solis closed her notebook and looked at Maya with the expression of someone completing an assessment that had been running throughout the conversation underneath the visible questions. The 11-second window, Solis said. Maya looked at her. Carver, across the table, was looking at his tablet. Carver flagged it, Solis said. The northeastern approach. You calculated it at 300 meters in the dark. I observed the guard's behavior pattern and measured the rotation gap. It was 4 calculations, same result. You made that approach on a calculation you'd run in your head 4 times. Yes. At 300 meters, in the dark, with a compound that had 40-plus armed personnel. The calculation was sound. Solis looked at her for a moment, not skeptically. More like someone verifying a data point they already had from a different source. Before you came to Blackstone Division, Solis said, you were at the Varsa training program for 14 months. Maya went still. Precision assessment, human factors analysis, tactical calculation under degraded conditions. Solis said it evenly, without particular emphasis. That's not a standard Overwatch assignment? It's in my service record. The general outline is, the specifics of what you were doing there are in a separate file. Solis closed her notebook. Carver read the separate file. Carver looked up from his tablet and looked at Maya and said nothing. I've read the separate file, Solis continued. I want to be direct with you, Sergeant, because I think you've earned directness over the last 72 hours. The work you did on this mountain is consistent with a capability profile that is not well utilized in a standard Overwatch assignment. And the events of the last 72 hours have created a set of circumstances that make it possible to address that. Maya looked at Solis, at Carver, at the closed notebook on the table. What does addressing it look like? She asked. Solis picked up the notebook and stood. That's a conversation for after you've slept for more than 4 minutes. She said it without humor, which meant she wasn't being funny. There's a formal review of the AWOL designation happening this afternoon. Carver is testifying. You should know that before you hear about it from someone else. She walked out of the debrief room. Hendricks followed her. Carver lingered at the door. The Varsa program, Maya said. Yes, Carver said. How long has that been in your picture? Since before the mission. He paused. The separate file has been sitting in the wrong category for about 2 years. Someone put it there by mistake or by intention. We don't know which yet. We're finding out. He opened the door. The review is at 1400. You should be there. He left. Maya sat in the empty debrief room for a moment, looking at the table, at the place where Solis's notebook had been. The surface was clean except for a faint impression where the pen had rested, a small, specific mark that would be gone by the next time someone sat at this table. She thought about the separate file, about the Varsa program, and 14 months of work that had been categorized incorrectly for 2 years and had sat there while she ran Overwatch assignments and listened to people say she was there because of politics, about what it meant that Carver had read it before the mission, about what it meant that Solis had read it too and had asked about the 11 seconds, not skeptically, but like someone verifying data they already had. She stood up. She had 3 hours before the review at 1400, and Solis was right that she'd only slept 4 minutes, and the bunk was still there. She went back to it. This time she slept for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and she didn't dream about anything. She woke up 2 minutes before her alarm. Not because she'd set an internal clock deliberately. It was simply what her body did after enough years of operating on compressed timelines. A biological adaptation to a life where the difference between 2 minutes early and 2 minutes late had mattered enough times that her nervous system had started treating the margin as a survival mechanism. She lay on the bunk for 30 seconds, looking at the ceiling, and then she sat up and started putting herself back together, which in the absence of a shower and a full kit change meant tightening what could be tightened and accepting the rest. The review was in 40 minutes. She found the bathroom at the end of the corridor and used cold water on her face until the last of the sleep debt receded from the surface, which was not the same as it receding from underneath, but underneath was a problem for later. She checked her gear by habit. She looked at herself in the mirror above the sink for a moment. Not long, just long enough to take an honest inventory. And then she went to find the review. The review was held in the administrative conference room on the base's east wing, which was the most formal space available short of the commanding general's office. And its use for this purpose was itself a signal that Carver had either requested it or arranged for it to be suggested in a way that made the request unnecessary. The room had a long table, 8 chairs, a wall-mounted display, and windows that faced east, currently showing a sky that was moving from the pale gray of morning towards something with actual color in it. Alderman was already seated when she arrived, which she had expected. He had his folder and his coffee and his posture, and he had 2 of his staff seated behind him in chairs against the wall that were technically outside the table, but were positioned close enough to be present. On the opposite side of the table were Carver and Solis, and beside Solis was a third person Maya hadn't seen before. A brigadier general named Thane, whose presence at Blackstone Forward Base was not something that happened on a standard Tuesday morning, which meant Carver, or Solis, or both of them, had made calls in the hours since the debrief that had moved faster than Maya had anticipated. Webb and Lim were seated at the far end of the table as witness personnel. Lim had a folder of his own, the terrain analysis, the imagery overlays, the signals intercept summary, and he was sitting with the careful stillness of someone who has prepared thoroughly for something and is managing the gap between preparation and execution. Maya took the empty chair beside Lim. Lim looked at her once and then looked at the table. "You look marginally better," he said, very quietly. "I slept 2 hours." "I slept 0. She didn't have a response to that was adequate, so she said nothing. General Thane opened the review without preamble, in the tone of someone who had read the file and had opinions about it that he was not going to express emotionally. He summarized the scope, the AWOL designation, the unauthorized operational activity, the outcomes, and the question of how all 3 of those things should be officially characterized in the record. And he invited Carver to speak first. Carver spoke for 11 minutes. He covered the facility, the asset, the intelligence value of the extraction, and the timeline in a sequence that was so precisely organized it was clearly not improvised. He had structured this the way he structured everything, with the conclusion visible at every point and the evidence leading to it without detours. He presented the signals intercept analysis, Lim's overlay work, and the specific timeline of the stand-down order relative to the extraction, and he did all of it in the same flat patient register that he'd used in the corridor that morning, which was a register specifically designed to convey that the facts required no advocacy because the facts were sufficient on their own. Alderman sat through it with the controlled expression of a man receiving information he disagrees with in a forum where disagreement requires evidence rather than authority. When Carver finished, Thane looked at Alderman. "Colonel, your response to the timeline." Alderman opened his folder. The stand-down order was filed within authorized parameters based on the resource picture and weather assessment at the time of filing. The operational boundary. The operational boundary excluded a facility that was actively running an intelligence extraction on a Directorate 7 asset, Thane said. That's established. The facility wasn't in our threat mapping. Why wasn't it in your threat mapping? A pause. The specific pause of a man whose answer requires more careful construction than the question's directness allows for. The northeastern sector was assessed as low priority based on historical activity patterns, Alderman said. Based on what analysis? The standard quarterly assessment. The standard quarterly assessment that Corporal Lim's work subsequently contradicted using data that was already in your intelligence section's possession. Thane said it without raising his voice. He didn't need to. I've read Corporal Lim's analysis. It uses vehicle movement data and signals intercepts that were in your system before the night of March 14th. The facility wasn't in your threat mapping because nobody looked at the data that was already available. Alderman's color was doing the thing it had done in the corridor that morning, changing without being dramatic about it, a flush working up from the collar. The AWOL designation, Thane said. Walk me through the decision. Sergeant Voss ignored a direct evacuation order and abandoned her assigned position. After successfully coordinating the extraction of 4 personnel, including 2 wounded and 2 civilian intelligence assets, under active fire, Carver's voice. Even. That's in Webb's debrief. That's documented. She then went into hostile territory without authorization and located and recovered a missing captain who had been listed as presumed dead, Thane said, and extracted a Directorate 7 asset, who, had he remained in that facility for another 4 to 6 hours, would have been compromised to a degree that Solis can characterize if you'd like her to. Please, Alderman said, in a tone that meant the opposite. Solis characterized it. She did so briefly, and with the particular precision of someone who knows that too much detail in an unsecured room is its own problem. She said enough. Alderman's 2 staff members behind him were both looking at the table by the time she finished. Thane looked at the folder in front of him for a moment. Then he looked up. The AWOL designation is removed from the record effective immediately, he said. The notation regarding emotional response and compromised judgment is also removed. He looked at Alderman. Colonel, a formal review of the threat assessment process in the northeastern sector will be conducted by an external evaluator. I'll be recommending that review to the division commander today. He paused. Additionally, the stand-down order filed at 0520 will be noted in the operational record as having been filed during an active recovery situation, and the timeline will be documented in full. Alderman said nothing. He was doing the mathematics of his position in real time, and the mathematics were not producing a comfortable result. Do you have anything further? Thane asked him. A long moment. No, sir. Then we're done here. Alderman stood, collected his folder, and walked out of the room with his staff. He did not look at Maya on the way out. She didn't watch him go. When the door closed, Thane looked at her directly for the first time since the review had started. Sergeant Voss. Sir? Your file is being updated today. The complete file, including the portion that has been miscategorized for approximately 2 years. He said it without explanation, which meant Solis had briefed him before the review, and the characterization was intentional. Solis will speak with you separately about what that means in practical terms. Yes, sir. He stood, looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not warm. Thane was not a warm man, from what she could observe in 45 minutes. But that was honest, which was a different quality and in some ways more valuable. What you did on that mountain was not in the manual, he said. No, sir. The manual gets written by people who've done things that worked. Sometimes the manual falls behind. He picked up his folder. Solis. He nodded at her and walked out. The room was quiet for a moment. Lim let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for some portion of the last 45 minutes. That folder, Maya said to him. The analysis. It's documented, Lim said. 3 backup copies in separate locations. Hendricks has one. Hendricks is going to be fine through this review process? Hendricks is the one who told me to make the backups. Lim looked at his folder. He said, and I'm quoting directly, if Alderman asks about this analysis, the copy in the system is the only copy I'm aware of. And then he looked at me for about 4 seconds. Webb, at the far end of the table, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Carver was putting documents back into his case. Voss, when you're ready, Solis wants an hour. I'm ready now. Eat something first. Carver, eat something first, he said again, and left. She ate something. Then she found Solis in a small office off the main corridor that had been made available for the duration, and she sat across from Solis at a desk that belonged to someone else entirely. And Solis opened a folder and they talked for an hour and 6 minutes. The Varsa program was a precision assessment and applied analysis track that ran under a Joint Directorate 7 and Special Operations Training umbrella, and the 14 months Maya had spent there had produced a capability profile that lived in a separate file because the standard personnel categorization didn't have a field for what the profile described. Someone had solved this problem by dropping the file into an administrative holding category that was technically correct and practically invisible, and it had stayed there for 2 years while Maya ran Overwatch assignments in Blackstone Division and Alderman wrote marginal notes about emotional response. The person who filed it incorrectly, Maya said. Was it a mistake? Solis looked at her. We don't know yet. It may have been administrative. It may have been something else. She paused. The investigation into the mission profile compromise will include a review of all personnel file handling in the relevant period. If it was something else, it will come out. Maya absorbed that. The implications of it, that someone might have deliberately buried her file, that the reasons for doing so connected to something larger than bureaucratic indifference, were something she could trace but couldn't fully see the end of yet. She filed it. It would come out or it wouldn't, and either way, it was not the thing she needed to focus on right now. What does the practical future look like? She asked. Solis turned a page in the folder. There's a unit designation within the Directorate 7 operational structure that works with embedded personnel from special operations backgrounds. Precision analysis, field application, the intersection of those two things. It's small. It doesn't appear on organizational charts. She looked up. Your profile fits it better than anything else in the current structure. That's not a diplomatic assessment. It's the accurate one. What happens to my current assignment? Your current assignment ends with this deployment. What comes after is the conversation we're having right now. Maya looked at the desk, at the folder, at the patch of sky visible through the small window. Fully blue now, the morning having resolved into something that looked from inside like a clear day. Cole, she said. What about him? He's part of what happened on that mountain. Whatever gets documented, the facility, the asset, the mission profile compromise, he needs to be part of that record. He will be. Not as the missing captain who got recovered, as the commanding officer who identified the intelligence compromise in real time under fire and made the decisions that kept the analysis chain intact. Solis looked at her for a moment. You're advocating for his record. I'm stating what happened accurately. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Solis made a note. It'll be reflected accurately. Maya nodded. Then yes, she said. Solis looked up. Yes to what? To the unit designation, to the conversation we've been having. She paused. I want to know what's in the full file first. The Varsa assessment, all of it, not the summary. That's a reasonable condition. And I want Lim. Solis raised an eyebrow. He built the facility analysis from data that was already in the system and that nobody else was looking at. That's the capability you're describing, finding the thing that's there but isn't being seen. He's better at it than anyone I've worked with. She held Solis's gaze. He stays part of this, whatever this is. That's the other condition. Solis was quiet for a moment. She looked at Maya the way she'd looked at her throughout the debrief, with the particular attention of someone running an assessment that had multiple layers and finding that the layers were consistent with each other. I'll look at his file, Solis said. No promises on the timeline. That's fair. Solis closed the folder. Go see Cole. He's been out of surgery for 3 hours and he's been asking for you since he woke up, which the medical staff has been managing with decreasing success. The surgical recovery room was small and smelled of antiseptic and the particular staleness of recycled air, and Cole was sitting up at an angle that suggested the medical staff had adjusted the bed, and he had subsequently adjusted it further than they'd intended. His left arm was in a compression dressing from the elbow down. His color was better than it had been on the mountain, which was a low standard, but better than it had been that morning, which was a more meaningful comparison. He looked at her when she came through the door in the way that people look at things they've been waiting to see. You were in a review, he said. I was. How did it go? The AWOL designation is gone. Alderman's threat assessment process is under external review. Thane is briefing the division commander today. Cole was quiet for a moment. Thane was here. Carver moved fast. Carver was already moving when the birds went up. He shifted slightly against the bed, suppressing the reaction to his ribs that showed only in the brief tightness around his eyes. Sit down. You look like you're about to fall over. She sat in the chair beside the bed. It was a standard medical bay chair, plastic and unforgiving, and it was still significantly better than 71 hours of frozen mountain. The asset, Cole said. Sarek. Do you know what he was carrying? Enough. Solis briefed me on the general shape of it. The mission profile compromise. It goes up further than Alderman's level. Carver's team is working the access point. It'll take time, but it'll close. Cole looked at the compression dressing on his arm, at the ceiling, at the window, which showed the same blue sky she'd seen from Solis's office. The 2 assets from the safe house, he said. What happens to them? That's a question for Carver. I don't have the answer. They were instruments, not architects. I know. Whatever they were promised, whatever leverage was used to put them in that safe house, that matters. To the charge, to the disposition. She looked at him. You've been lying in a recovery bed for 3 hours working this. I've been lying in a recovery bed for 3 hours with nothing to do except work this. Your ribs are cracked, not critical. I've had cracked ribs before. He looked at her. The review. What did Thane say to you specifically? He said the manual gets written by people who've done things that worked, and sometimes it falls behind. Cole considered that. That's either a compliment or a criticism of the manual. I took it as both. Something moved across his face that was close to a smile but didn't fully commit. Solis spoke with you. An hour. And? She told him. Not everything. There were elements that were appropriately compartmented even from Cole, but the substantive shape of it, the unit designation, the conditions she'd set, the outcome of the conversation. He listened without interrupting, which was the thing he did when he was taking something seriously. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Lim, he said. Lim. Good call. He paused. Webb? Webb's assignment runs through end of deployment. After that, I don't know. Webb will land on his feet. He always does. He looked at the window again. This unit designation. You said yes. I said yes. Knowing that the file was buried for 2 years, knowing there might have been a reason for that. Knowing that, she confirmed, the investigation will sort out the reason, and the unit is separate from whatever the investigation finds. You trust Solis? She thought about it honestly. I trust that Solis's interests align with accurate outcomes. That's enough to work with. Cole nodded slowly. He was looking at the compression dressing again, not really seeing it. On the mountain, he said. In the alcove. When you found me. He stopped. Yeah. I'd been in there for about 18 hours at that point. I'd had time to... He stopped again, reorganized. I'd made a certain assessment of the probable outcomes. She waited. And then you came through that gap in the rock, and the first thing you said was, "How bad is the arm?" He looked at her. Not, "Are you okay?" Not anything else. Just the arm. The arm was the most visible variable. I know. That's... He shook his head slightly, not dismissing it, but dealing with it. That's what I mean. You walked into that alcove and immediately started solving the problem. No preamble. No... He stopped a third time. Cole. Yeah. You would have done the same thing. I would have tried. A pause. You're better at it than I am. She looked at him. At the compression dressing and the laceration that had been cleaned and closed on his hairline, still visible under the dressing edge. At the way he was sitting, carefully, managing the ribs with the same automatic discipline he applied to everything. I need to say something, Cole said, and I want you to let me finish before you tell me it was just the job. She waited. I have run operations with a lot of people. Good operators, some of the best I've worked with. And I have never had someone make the specific series of choices you made on this mountain and have all of them be correct. He said it plainly, without performance. Not strategically correct, tactically, analytically, situationally correct. Every single decision, including the ones that had no good option, just less bad ones. You made the right call every time. He paused. That's not common. I've been doing this long enough to know it's not common. She said nothing for a moment. The chair was still uncomfortable. The room still smelled of antiseptic. Outside, the blue sky had not changed. You trusted me, she said finally. When I was assigned to your unit, you handed me the brief and gave me a rotation without making me prove I belonged there first. You already had the record. A lot of people had the record. They still made it a process. She looked at him. You didn't. That matters. It mattered every day I was in your unit, and it mattered on the mountain. Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the window. When you're operational with the new assignment, he said, I'd like to know. Not the details. I understand compartmentalization. Just whether you're okay. She looked at him. Yeah, I'll let you know. He nodded. Good. The door opened and the medic came in with the particular expression of someone whose tolerance for unsanctioned conversations in a recovery room has reached its limit. Captain, you need to rest. I'm resting. I'm horizontal. You've been talking for... I'm still horizontal. He looked at Maya. She was just leaving. She stood. At the door, she stopped. Cole. He looked at her. The mountain, she said. I'd do it again. He held her gaze for a moment. I know, he said. That's what I meant. She walked out. The formal documentation completed over the following 72 hours with the thoroughness of a process that had been given both the mandate and the time to be thorough. The AWOL designation was removed from Maya's service record and replaced with a commendation notation that described her actions in terms precise enough to be accurate and general enough to protect the operational details. Cole's record was updated to reflect the full scope of his actions on the night of March 14th, not the abbreviated version that had gone into the initial incident report, but the version that included the deliberate exposure he'd accepted to cover his team's withdrawal, documented by Webb's testimony and Lim's reconstruction of the radio traffic timeline. Alderman's formal review began on the fourth day. The external evaluator was a two-person team from the Division Inspector General's office, and they worked methodically through the threat assessment processes, the intelligence handling procedures, and the specific decisions made in the 72 hours surrounding March 14th. The review was not a rapid process, and it was not designed to be. It was designed to be complete, and complete took the time it took. What it found, over the course of 3 weeks, was a pattern of decisions that individually could be characterized as conservative and collectively amounted to a systematic exclusion of data that contradicted preferred assessments. No single decision was indefensible in isolation. The pattern was: Alderman was relieved of operational command and transferred to an administrative role at a facility that was not in the Corvan region. His staff underwent individual reviews. The duty officer who had written the AWOL designation without reading Webb's testimony was formally censured. The personnel file irregularity, the miscategorization of Maya's Varsa assessment, was investigated separately. The investigation took longer and produced a result that was more complicated. The filing had been deliberate. The person who had done it on the instructions of someone who had wanted Maya's capability profile to remain invisible, which connected to the larger mission profile compromise investigation in a way that Solis described to Maya in a brief, factual meeting as consistent with the pattern we've been building. The person who had given the instruction was now part of a separate investigation that Maya was not cleared to know the full details of, and she accepted that and filed it and let the process run. Sarek recovered. He was moved to a secure medical facility during the first week, and Maya didn't see him again, which was correct and expected. Carver told her, in passing, in the corridor of the East Wing on the morning of the 5th day, that Sarek had asked him to pass a message. "What message?" she asked. He said, "Tell her I did the verification process because I had to, not because I doubted her." Carver paused. "He said you'd understand what that meant." She did. On the 7th day, Lim's file crossed Solis's desk. Maya found out about it from Lim himself, who came to find her in the temporary quarters with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not shock, not surprise exactly, but the particular look of someone who has been operating under one assumption about the shape of their life and has had that assumption revised substantially. "Solis called me in," he said. And she had my file and she asked me to walk her through the facility analysis. The whole thing, methodology first." He paused. "Then she asked me where I learned to build layered event correlation from incomplete data sources." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I figured it out because the standard methods kept producing incomplete pictures, and incomplete pictures get people killed." He paused again. She wrote something down. Maya looked at him. "Are you in?" He looked back at her. "She said she'd be in touch within a week." "That's yes." "That might be yes." "Lim, that's yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Webb's deployment ends in 3 weeks." "I know." "Oh. He's going to want to know what happens next." "Then tell him." She paused. "The part you can tell him." Lim nodded. He stood there for a moment longer, looking at a point on the wall in the way he did when he was processing something he hadn't finished processing yet. "On the mountain," he said. "Those 72 hours. Were you—" He stopped. "What? Were you scared?" She thought about it honestly, because Lim deserved the honest answer. "In the first 24 hours. After that, I was too busy." "That's not—" He started to say it wasn't reassuring and then reconsidered. "Actually, that is reassuring, in a specific way. Go get some sleep. I've been awake for— I know how long you've been awake. Go." He went. Cole's discharge from the medical bay happened on the 8th day, which was 2 days later than the medical staff recommended, and 1 day earlier than he was supposed to be discharged, a compromise that everyone involved treated as a victory for their respective positions. He came out of the medical bay in a sling and a clean uniform that someone had sourced for him, and he walked to the perimeter where Webb was standing in the position that Webb had apparently been occupying at intervals since they got back, looking at the northeast. Maya was already there. The three of them stood at the perimeter for a while without talking, looking at the Corvon Ridge in the clear morning light. From this distance, on a clear day, it was genuinely impressive. The scale of it, the way it dominated the northern horizon, the particular quality of light on snow at altitude that made the peaks look like they were producing their own illumination rather than reflecting someone else's. "It looks different from here," Webb said. "It always looks different from the outside," Cole said. "That's almost profound." Almost. Maya looked at the ridge, at the specific section of it that corresponded roughly to where O.P. Vega had been, the ridgeline she'd sat on for 3 hours before deciding to go northeast instead of south. From here, that decision looked smaller than it had felt from inside it. The mountain looked traversable, navigable, the way things always look when you've already been through them and come out the other side. "What happens now for you?" Webb asked Cole. "Medical leave. Physical therapy for the arm. About 6 weeks before they'll let me back in rotation." He paused. "Then whatever's next." "And what's next?" Cole looked at the ridge. "Something better than what was before. That's the plan." Webb nodded. He looked at Maya. "And you?" She looked at the mountains one more time, at the specific line of the eastern ridgeline that she had climbed in the dark, with a man who had 2 fragments in his arm and cracked ribs, and had reached, and had stood on, and had looked out from across a facility that had no right to be invisible, and had been anyway. At the country below the ridge that she had moved through for 72 hours on nothing but observation and calculation, and the refusal to accept that an ending was final before she had checked. "Something I'm actually built for," she said. "That's the plan." Webb absorbed that. He didn't ask for more and she didn't offer it, because some things were appropriately said in the form they were in, and unpacking them for someone else's clarity wasn't always the right move. They stood at the perimeter until the cold became the kind of cold that required a decision, and then Cole said he needed to eat something before the next medical appointment, and Webb said he had a briefing, and the moment dispersed the way moments do. Not dramatically, just by returning to the forward movement of things that needed to be done. Maya stayed a moment longer. She looked at the ridge one final time, at the place on it where the smoke had risen on the night of March 14th, from a position she had been watching through a scope while the person she was watching it for disappeared into the dark. At the place where she had made the choice that nobody had authorized and nobody had validated, that had been written into her file as a failure of judgment by a man who had never stood on a frozen mountain in the dark and decided that the available information was insufficient to accept an ending. She had no sentiment about mountains. They were terrain. They were problems to be solved. They were indifferent in the way that all large things were indifferent. And they taught you things about yourself not because they intended to, but because the conditions they created had no room for the version of yourself that wasn't accurate. What she had learned on the Corvon Ridge was not something she would have described as a revelation. It was more like a confirmation of things she had already known about herself that had not yet been required in full. The patience, the calculation, the particular kind of refusal that looked from the outside like stubbornness or sentiment, and that was actually neither of those things. It was simply the recognition that the most important decisions you ever make are the ones that you make when everyone around you has decided the situation is settled. The situation is never settled until you have checked. She turned away from the ridge and walked back into the base, and behind her the mountains stood in their indifferent clarity against a sky that had, against all reasonable expectation, turned out to be a decent day. 3 weeks later, Maya Voss signed documents that did not exist in any standard personnel system in an office that was not listed on any base directory, witnessed by Solace and a second person she was not introduced to by name. The documents formalized an assignment that she could not describe to most of the people she knew, doing work that she was, in every measurable way, exactly suited to do. Lim signed equivalent documents 4 days after that. Cole, at a physical therapy appointment 600 kilometers away, received a single-line message from an address he didn't recognize that said, "We're okay, both of us." V. He read it twice. Then he put the phone away and went back to the exercises that the therapist had told him to take seriously, which he did, because taking the work seriously was the only version of himself he knew how to be. There is a kind of person the world tends to underestimate, not because the evidence is absent, but because the evidence is in a file that nobody is looking at, or in a choice that nobody authorized, or in 11 seconds of darkness that only one person had the patience to count 4 times before trusting. These people do not announce themselves. They do not require the announcement. They show up, they check, and they do not accept that the ending is written until they have looked at every word of it themselves. The mountain does not remember them, but the people they brought